For years, I have heard speakers at conferences all around the world tell financial brand leaders, almost to a point of insult, you have to tell a better story. And I'd sit there thinking, what the heck does that even mean? Tell a better story. And I would agree, but I didn't know what that actually meant. And so I became very frustrated because, yeah, you can tell a better story, but if you're not telling someone how to actually do that, there's no practical perspective to take away. So how do you tell an even better story? The heart of the matter, it boils down to marketing communication. And when we think about financial brand stories, they really haven't changed. So the majority of, we'll just say banks and credit unions, the quote unquote story that is being communicated through both marketing communication and even sales communication, it can be distilled down into three different buckets. You're promoting some type of great rate, you're announcing some type of amazing service, or you're communicating this commoditized laundry list of lookalike product features. It's not that this is a bad story, because if you really boil it down, a lot of this communication, there is no story to begin with in the first place. There's, I would say, a very specific problem with the traditional messaging here, and it's communication patterns that we're looking to identify, because this quote unquote story, if you will, about rates and service and lookalike laundry list of product features, who's it about? Who's the hero of this narrative? It's the financial brand. It's the bank. It's the credit union. It's the fintech. It's you. There's an opportunity now to step outside of yourself, to step outside of ourselves as financial brands, to let go of our ego. And odds are, if you're like the hundreds of financial brand leaders that I've coached and have guided along their digital growth journey, you might be suffering from a condition that I call the narcissistic marketing model. And what I call the narcissistic marketing model is really a holdover from the legacy days of broadcast marketing. Narcissistic marketing is when a financial brand might have a solution to a problem for a mass market who might be called to action. But how exactly are you summoning that call to action? In the traditional narcissistic narrative structure here, once again, who's this story about, quote unquote? The story. It's about us, our great rates, our amazing service, our lookalike product features. We're positioning ourselves as the hero. Now, what's so bad about that, you might be wondering? I want you to stop for a minute and take you back to your 9th or 10th grade literature class. And even if you don't remember your 9th or 10th grade literature class, we're going to give you a quick lesson around literary history. And this is something that I studied for around really deeply for 2 or 3 years, coming back to when I was hearing people at conferences saying, you have to tell a better story. And I'm like, well, what does that mean? And how do you do that? When you look at story, literature, archetype history, every classic adventure, every epic poem even, there's only room for one hero. And if you add a second hero to that story structure, the secondary hero usually becomes the anti-hero, the antagonist instead of the protagonist. And when I work with financial brand leaders and coach them in training sessions and in workshops, I sometimes really hit this message hard. I tell them, you can't be the hero. You're not the hero. Obviously, I get some pushback on this, But when we go deeper and when we have a conversation and a dialogue around this is where clarity begins to set in. And maybe you're having a hard time with this concept. I want you to think back on your own life, to the different stages, the different scenes, the different chapters that you have written in your own story. And I want you to do this because we all walk around believing that we're the hero in the narratives that we tell ourselves. And that's fair. We are the heroes of our own story. But we're not necessarily the hero in other people's stories. Remember that old song from Bonnie Taylor? I'm not going to sing it to you to spare you, but it went something like this. I need a hero. I'm holding on for a hero till the end of the night. Maybe that tune is ringing a bell in your head. Well, when it comes to financial brand marketing and sales communication strategies, she's wrong about that. This is a message of a song. It's not very accurate and really can cause some pain for financial brand marketing and sales leaders. The truth is, people are not looking for a hero externally when it comes to financial and money matters. What they're looking for is something even deeper, something even greater. And we can learn so much and truly transform our marketing and sales communication strategies by just simply looking back over thousands of years of literary history, all the way back to the earliest narratives. Take Gilgamesh, for example, the Epic of Gilgamesh. Now, to save you time and pain and heartache from having to do that yourself, Joseph Campbell had studied this for us. And in 1949, Joseph Campbell came out with a book called The Hero with a Thousand Faces. And what he did is he essentially mapped out the different archetypal narrative structures, and he identified common patterns in the way that stories have been told, stories have been communicated throughout the ages. But why is it important to understand these narrative and story structures, especially in the age of AI? Well, first and foremost, we have to remember that money is confusing. I've talked about this on the podcast. Money has an inherently high cognitive load, and people are looking for someone that they can trust to guide them beyond their confusion, their financial conflict. And trust, very simplified, it comes down to two words. Two things, I should say. Trust is just words and actions. It's the sum of words and actions. It's communication. And I know Ron Shevlin has shared this many times before, but I think it's important to note when it comes to trust, it's all about relationship. And Ron knows people don't want a relationship with a brick. And what he's talking about is the physical branch. But I'd add to Ron's thoughts that people don't want a relationship with an AI bot. When it comes down to it, human beings respond to stories, not just intellectually, but more importantly, emotionally as well. Stories have bounded us together as human beings through the course of our existence as a species. Stories they've been key to our survival. They are embedded in our DNA, deep within our soul. And the best stories worth telling, the best stories worth remembering, every story starts with a point of conflict. Think about Derek Coleman, how that story started. He said, I've been deaf since I was 3. We immediately enter into conflict in that narrative. But we have to understand why. Why start a story with conflict? Because when working with financial brand leaders, they want to shy away from conflict. And I'm saying, no, we need to lean into conflict. And when we think about financial matters, there's a tremendous amount of conflict that people are feeling and experiencing. The reason we lead with conflict in the narrative, this is what gets people to focus. Particularly if someone can relate to the conflict. And there's a lot of relating that can happen to financial conflict that people feel. Because it's during the point of conflict that our brains produce cortisol. And what does cortisol do? It increases our focus. Conflict captures attention. Now, on the flip side of cortisol, there's oxytocin. Oxytocin is that feel-good chemical. And what does that do when it comes to story and narrative? It promotes connection. It embodies and inspires empathy. And the chemical, cortisol, when it's released in our brains, it is released when we see people's faces and their emotional reactions within the story. Once again, if you're listening to this on Apple Podcast or Spotify or any other podcast player that this podcast streams on, I invite you to come back and rewatch this on YouTube so that you can watch the narrative of Derek Coleman and see how it gives you a different experience. Because that's the idea of watching, not just listening. It's the idea of watching. When we watch people's faces, when we see their reaction, when we see even the faces of people who look like us. This is why telling a story visually, through images, through videos, has the power to create such an empathetic connection through emotional experience. We know that the power of story can be unlocked at the very end. That's where it all comes to a resolution, the happy ending. Because happy endings to a story, that is what triggers the limbic system to release the dopamine. That in turn, what does it do for us being a participant of the story, to watch the story unfold? When we have that conflict resolution, when we have the happy ending, that dopamine release helps us to feel more hopeful. It helps us to feel more optimistic. And one of the things I've always said is when it comes to financial matters, people are looking for two things. They're looking for help. They're looking for hope. Hope often has to come before they are open and able and willing to receive help. And the way to give people hope is through story.